The truth about manifestation, the hidden provision code in Pistis Sophia. Why thought alone cannot unlock the flow of divine supply. For centuries, seekers believed that thought alone could shape reality and attract everything they desired. Yet hidden within an ancient text discovered among the mystical traditions of early Christianity lies a warning few have truly understood. The book known as Pistis Sophia speaks of a deeper law, one that goes far beyond the popular idea of positive thinking. According to this forgotten teaching, the mind by itself is not powerful enough to open the gates of true provision. Something older, more sacred, and more precise must be awakened within the human being. In the symbolic language of the early followers of Jesus, this awakening was called the restoration of Sophia, and once this secret is understood, the entire idea of manifestation begins to change. Long before modern ideas about manifestation became popular, the early spiritual communities surrounding the teachings of Jesus preserved a very different understanding of how divine provision enters human life. Their writings, many of which were discovered centuries later in the Nag Hammadi library, describe a universe governed not merely by human thought, but by alignment between the soul and the divine order. Among these texts, Pistis Sophia occupies a mysterious place, presenting a symbolic narrative about the soul's struggle to return to the light. In the story, Sophia represents the human soul itself, searching for truth and restoration after becoming lost in the lower realms of confusion. Her journey is not solved by wishing, imagining, or mentally projecting outcomes into the world. Instead, Sophia repeatedly calls upon higher assistance, acknowledging that the restoration of divine order requires something deeper than personal intention. The text describes moments of realization where Sophia understands that true elevation happens only when inner consciousness becomes aligned with divine wisdom. This idea challenges many modern interpretations of spiritual power. Today, countless teachings suggest that thought alone creates reality, that imagining abundance automatically brings provision into existence. But the ancient tradition preserved in Pistis Sophia presents a different perspective. Thought may initiate movement, but it is not the source of power. The real transformation begins when consciousness awakens to its forgotten origin and reconnects with the divine structure of existence. The early followers of Jesus often spoke through symbols because they believed spiritual truths could not be transmitted through simple instruction alone. Stories, metaphors, and layered language were used to awaken recognition within the listener. In this way, the story of Sophia was never meant to describe only a distant cosmic drama. It was meant to mirror the condition of every human being searching for meaning, provision, and restoration. When read through this lens, the message becomes clear. Provision does not flow merely from the activity of the mind. It begins when the soul remembers its place within the divine order. And according to these ancient teachings, that remembrance is the first step toward opening the channels through which true provision enters human life. One of the most fascinating elements of Pistis Sophia is the repeated moment when Sophia realizes that effort alone cannot restore her to the higher realms. Again and again, she attempts to rise, yet something prevents her ascent. It is only when she turns inward in humility and calls upon the higher light that movement finally begins. This moment represents a profound spiritual principle preserved in many early mystical traditions connected to the teachings of Jesus. The ancient communities believed that the universe operates through harmony between the inner being and the divine structure that sustains existence. When this harmony is absent, human effort produces only limited results. Thoughts may move energy, intentions may influence perception, but the deeper current of provision remains closed. According to the symbolism of the text, the soul must first remember its origin before the pathways of restoration become visible. This is why many early spiritual teachings emphasized inner awakening rather than external control of reality. They believed that when consciousness becomes illuminated by divine wisdom, the conditions of life begin to reorganize naturally. Provision, guidance, an opportunity appear, not because the mind forced them into existence, but because alignment with the higher order has been restored. In this context, the story of Sophia becomes a map for awakening awareness rather than a manual for mental manifestation. Each stage of her journey reveals a deeper realization about the nature of spiritual power. The restoration of light within the soul becomes the gateway through which divine provision flows. Imagine beginning your journey with the two most powerful Aramaic words that open everything: a complete guide, correct sound, full meaning, and sacred protocol exists for those who feel the call. Check the pinned comment. The early followers of Jesus believed that sacred words carried more than symbolic meaning. They represented keys capable of opening inner perception when understood and practiced correctly. Within their tradition, awakening consciousness was never separated from sacred language, prayer, and remembrance of divine wisdom. And according to the hidden symbolism preserved in Pistis Sophia, the journey toward true provision begins not with controlling reality, but with awakening the deeper awareness that reconnects the soul with the divine light it once knew. As the narrative of Pistis Sophia continues, the text begins to reveal a deeper layer of spiritual understanding that early followers of Jesus considered essential for those seeking true restoration. Sophia's ascent is not simply a story of effort or persistence. It becomes a revelation about the nature of sacred sound, remembrance, and the ancient language that carried spiritual authority among the first communities who preserved the teachings of the Master. In the earliest traditions surrounding Jesus, Aramaic was not merely the language spoken in daily life. It was also the language through which sacred intention was transmitted. Words carried vibration, and vibration carried alignment. Among these sacred expressions, one phrase appears again and again across ancient prayers, blessings and teachings preserved through centuries: Abba. In Aramaic, this word expresses far more than the simple idea of Father. It carries the meaning of intimate origin, the living source from which all life flows. When the early mystics spoke this word, they were not addressing a distant authority in the sky. They were recognizing the divine source within the structure of existence itself. In the symbolic journey of Sophia, this recognition represents a turning point. Instead of struggling against the darkness through effort alone, she begins to remember the origin of light and calls upon it. The text describes this moment as the beginning of restoration, when divine assistance becomes possible. This ancient perspective suggests that the mind alone cannot generate provision because provision does not originate in thought. Thought can direct attention, but the deeper current flows from alignment with the divine source. In the language of the early followers of Jesus, remembrance of the source awakened a living connection with the spiritual order that sustains creation. If you feel drawn to go further, a guide already exists. The two most important Aramaic words that symbolize the beginning of everything: correct sound, full meaning, and a sacred protocol for those two words. The door is open. Check the pinned comment. The ancient communities believed that sacred words acted as gateways to awareness. When spoken with understanding, they reminded the soul of truths that had been forgotten. In the story of Sophia, this remembrance transforms struggle into ascent, confusion into clarity, and scarcity into the beginning of divine provision. Yet the text continues to reveal that even this realization is only the beginning of a much deeper awakening. As Sophia advances through the stages of her restoration, the teachings preserved in Pistis Sophia begin to reveal another dimension of spiritual power known. Among early Christian mystics, the text repeatedly emphasizes that knowledge alone is not sufficient. Even sacred words lose their transformative ability when they are spoken without awakened consciousness. For the early followers of Jesus, the true power of spiritual language emerged only when the inner being entered a state of living awareness. This is where another Aramaic word becomes profoundly important within the mystical tradition: Amen. In modern culture, this word is often treated as a simple ending to a prayer, yet in its original context it carried a much deeper meaning. In Aramaic spiritual understanding, Aman expressed the idea of alignment with truth, a declaration that the soul recognizes and agrees with the divine reality already present. Within the symbolic journey of Sophia, this recognition marks another turning point. After calling upon the higher light, Sophia begins to perceive that restoration is not something she forces into existence. Instead, it unfolds when her awareness aligns with the divine order she had forgotten. The moment of alignment opens pathways that were previously invisible. The early mystics believed that when consciousness reaches this state of recognition, provision begins to flow naturally, because resistance dissolves. The universe no longer appears as a hostile or indifferent environment, but as a living system governed by divine intelligence. In this state, the soul no longer attempts to dominate reality through thought. Instead, it participates in the harmony of creation. Many ancient teachers describe this transformation as the awakening of Gnosis, the inner knowing that reconnects the human spirit with its divine origin. Once this awakening begins, the search for provision changes completely. What once required struggle begins to move through pathways of alignment and guidance. For the early communities that preserved these teachings, sacred words like Abba and Amen were not formulas for controlling reality. They were reminders of a deeper truth, that the source of provision lies in awakening consciousness to the divine order that sustains all things. And according to the hidden wisdom of Pistis Sophia, the moment this awareness returns, the journey toward restoration and true provision truly begins. As the journey of Sophia approaches its final stages, the ancient text begins to reveal one of the most profound lessons preserved in the mystical traditions surrounding the teachings of Jesus. Throughout the narrative, Sophia's struggle gradually transforms into understanding. What began as confusion and separation slowly becomes remembrance and alignment. This transformation reflects the central principle of Gnosis, the awakening of inner knowledge that reconnects the soul with the divine order of existence. In the beginning of her journey, Sophia believed that her ascent depended on her own effort. Each attempt to rise through the lower realms represented the human tendency to rely solely on personal will and mental projection. But the deeper wisdom of the text reveals that restoration does not occur through force. Instead, it unfolds through recognition of the divine light that has always been present beyond the illusions of the material world. The early spiritual communities who preserved this teaching believed that human beings live within a universe structured by divine intelligence. When the soul forgets its origin, life becomes a constant struggle against limitation and uncertainty. Yet when remembrance returns, the relationship between the human spirit and the cosmos begins to change. Guidance appears, circumstances begin to reorganize, and the pathways that once seemed closed slowly begin to open. This is why the ancient teachings rarely focused on controlling the external world. Instead, they emphasized awakening the inner consciousness that perceives the divine presence behind all things. Once this perception becomes active, provision no longer appears as something that must be forced into existence through thought alone. It becomes a natural consequence of alignment with the divine structure that sustains creation. Within the symbolic language of Pistis Sophia, Sophia's restoration represents the moment when the soul finally recognizes the source of its strength. No longer lost in confusion, she begins to rise toward the light that had been calling her since the beginning of her journey. The text describes this movement as the return to the higher realms, where wisdom and divine harmony guide the unfolding of life. For those who study these ancient teachings today, the message remains remarkably relevant. The power of thought may influence perception, but the deeper current of provision flows only when consciousness reconnects with its sacred origin. In that moment, the soul begins to participate once again in the living harmony of the divine order. The wisdom preserved in Pistis Sophia invites the reader to reconsider many modern assumptions about spiritual power and manifestation. For centuries, seekers have explored different ways to influence the conditions of life, often focusing on the ability of thought to shape reality. Yet the ancient tradition presents a more nuanced perspective. It suggests that thought is not the source of creation, but a tool that becomes effective only when it operates in harmony with divine consciousness. Throughout the journey of Sophia, the central theme remains the restoration of awareness. Each stage of her ascent reveals that the soul must first awaken to its origin before the flow of divine assistance becomes visible. This awakening is not achieved through force or mental control, but through remembrance, humility, and alignment with the light that sustains all existence. In Tissensei, the story of Sophia mirrors the spiritual journey of every human being. Moments of confusion, limitation, and struggle often arise when the deeper connection with the divine order has been forgotten. Yet the ancient teachings remind us that restoration is always possible. When consciousness begins to awaken, life gradually reorganizes around the harmony that has always existed beyond the surface of ordinary perception. Everything begins with Aramaic words, a complete guide correct sound, full meaning, and sacred protocol is now available for those ready to start this journey. The door is open. Check the pinned comment. The early followers of Jesus believed that sacred knowledge was not meant to remain hidden forever. It was preserved in symbols, stories, and sacred language so that those who truly sought understanding could rediscover it. In this way, the journey described in Pistis Sophia becomes more than an ancient narrative. It becomes a living invitation to awaken the inner awareness that reconnects the soul with divine wisdom. Epilogue. At the heart of the ancient text, known as Pistis Sophia, lies a revelation that challenges many modern ideas about spiritual power. For generations, people have been taught that the mind alone possesses the ability to shape reality and attract what they desire. Yet the deeper wisdom preserved in the mystical traditions surrounding the teachings of Jesus suggests something far more profound. Thought may guide attention, but the true source of transformation emerges only when consciousness awakens to its divine origin. The journey of Sophia reveals that the soul does not rise through effort alone. Each stage of her ascent illustrates a hidden principle. Restoration begins when remembrance returns. The soul remembers the light from which it came, recognizes the divine order that sustains creation, and aligns with that living intelligence. In that moment, life begins to move in a different rhythm, one that cannot be produced by mental force, but unfolds naturally through spiritual harmony. The sacred words preserved in the Aramaic tradition remind seekers that ancient teachings were never merely philosophical ideas. Words such as Abba and Amen carried a deeper purpose. They were not intended to control the world, but to awaken the inner awareness that reconnects the human spirit with the living source of all provision. When spoken with understanding, they acted as gateways through which consciousness could remember its forgotten relationship with the divine. The hidden message of Pistis Sophia ultimately reveals that provision flows from alignment rather than control. The universe responds not simply to thoughts, but to the state of consciousness from which those thoughts arise. When the inner being awakens, the soul no longer struggles against existence. Instead, it begins to participate in the harmony of the divine order. And according to the ancient wisdom preserved in this text, that awakening is where the true flow of provision begins. In the next video, I will reveal another sacred Aramaic word connected to the teachings of Jesus. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and write in the comments what you thought of this content.